Stop. Hammer time. I am not MC Hammer, I am Wave Theory, lest there be any confusion, and this is the Schiit Mjolnir 3, a $1,300 US headphone amplifier that has the distinction of being named after Thor's hammer. This is a true Class A design that comes in at 16 pounds, so I'm going to set it down. This was a channel purchase. It was sent from Schiit, but not with their knowledge for review because I bought it with channel funds. So all thoughts that you are about to hear are mine and mine alone, and the link down in the description where you can buy this from Schiit is just a link. It's not an affiliate link because as far as I know, they don't have an affiliate link program. So there has been a lot of hype out there about this amplifier. I have done my best to avoid reading or watching any other reviews, but I have heard a lot of chatter about it just by being on internet forums and interacting with other audiophiles on Discord and that sort of thing, where there's just a lot of excitement about this amp. So I was really pumped to finally get this one in and get a chance to put it through its paces. Does it live up to the hype? Is it truly worthy of the name of Thor's hammer? Find out right after shameless self-promotion.
Hi, I'm Wave Theory's human companion, and he wants you to know that your support of this YouTube channel helps keep the reviews coming. If you enjoy Wave Theory's honest, thorough style, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the links in the description below to sign up for the Patreon or send him a tip through PayPal. All right, enjoy the musings.
Settle in and get comfy. This is going to be another long one because we have a lot of ground to cover. There are some interesting and unique features about this one that I need to talk about, features that affect the sound that I need to talk about. And also, I discovered some very interesting things about this in terms of what kinds of headphones it is comfortable driving and what kinds of headphones it is less comfortable driving, that I think is really going to help a potential buyer answer the value question as to whether or not this will be worth $1,300 to them. So use the timestamps, jump around. My takeaways on this, just to kind of wet your whistle here a little bit, is this is a very good headphone amplifier, particularly for lower impedance headphones. You get above about 60 ohms of impedance on the headphones, and the performance of this falls off a little bit. Not to the point where it sounds bad, but to the point where there are other options on the market that I think would be better suited if you have a headphone that has a higher impedance than about 60 ohms. The Vioelectric HPA V222 being one of those. And I will do a thorough comparison of this with the V222 here later on in the review. There's also a lot of hyperbole out there about this amp being able to punch up and compete with amps that cost, $2,500, $3,000 US and that sort of thing. And I do think that that is mostly hyperbole. I did a direct comparison of this with my Vioelectric HPA V281 and the Hi-Fiman Golden Wave Prelude amp. The 281 is $2,800 and the Prelude is $2,500. And this did not compete on that level, but it is still a very good $1,300 headphone amp that I think will be worthy of your consideration if you have a low impedance headphone and are looking for an amp in this price range. So use timestamps again to jump around and hear me unpack all of those things in this video because again, a lot of ground to cover. It's going to take a while. All right, so let's get into the unit itself, talk about some of the key features and that sort of thing on it. The rated power output on this is, I have it written down over there, it is 2 watts per channel into a 32 ohm load, and also which only drops to 1 watt per channel into a 300 ohm load, so there's some power supply goodness happening there. And then that's from the balanced output. This is a fully discrete Class A design. Schiit talks on their website how like at the left and right channel on this thing are totally independent from each other, save that they share the same circuit board. They each have their own power supply in there too, and like there's a lot of weight in this unit centered over here on this side. That's where the power supply is, and boy, it's like heavy, and I'm having to work hard to keep it balanced because that's where a lot of the weight of this unit comes from in there, right, is that power supply. But they also have chokes on the input and all of that, so it is a fully balanced, and then it's a single-ended Class A design. And single-ended here does not mean single-ended in the sense of like a 1/4-inch headphone output or an RCA analog connection versus an XLR kind of connection, which you typically think in audio. Single-ended is just the name for like the true and kind of at first the original Class A kind of amplifier topology. Okay, and Schiit explains this and unpacks it more on their website, and then they link to their article on their Schiit Happened thread on Headphone, where they talk about the different amp designs and Class A styles and all of that. So this is a single-ended Class A design, though it is a fully balanced electrical circuit which separates the left and right channels, functioning kind of in a dual mono manner, basically, from what I can gather from their website. That may not be 100% correct, but it's getting fairly warm in terms of the meaning in there. Okay. So there also, though, is a push-pull option on this. So you can put it into push-pull Class A mode, which is just a little bit different type of Class A. And it's not really the Class A that makers want you to think about when they say Class A, but Schiit's just being very honest and upfront saying that this is a different type of Class A with the push-pull mode. And the push-pull can help a little bit when the headphone load gets a little bit more challenging, gives you a little bit more power output, but I did find that it often changed the sound a little bit from the single-ended Class A mode. We'll unpack what that means in a little bit here too. You also have the option on this device of bringing in feedback circuitry or taking it out. Feedback, just real quick, being a type of amplifier circuit design that takes a small portion of the output of the amplifier stage, loops it back around to the input part of that stage, and compares that output to what was going into it, just to make sure that they are all aligned with each other, and then fixing any errors by summing them. All that. That's a very crude, very quick description. Google amplifier feedback if you want to look into what it really means. But on this unit, you have the option of having a zero feedback or putting in a little bit of feedback, and that actually changed the sound a little bit too, and I'll unpack that when we get to the sound description, and that's an option that you have on this unit as well. All right, other than that, there are two gain stages on here, high and a low. That's pretty straightforward, all of that. Okay. Other features on this. Let me go ahead and just show you the front panel here. We've got a bunch of switches, remind what's what. We have the input select between balanced and single-ended right here. We have the, do you want the headphone outputs active or do you want the preamp outputs active? Volume knob attached to the potentiometer here. And then we have the gain control, the single-ended versus push-pull Class A mode here switch. And then we have the, which one is that? That's the feedback on-off switch right there as well. On the back, we see a power input. We have the power switch on the back, which is fine with me on this kind of a solid state design. Then we have a full set of both balanced and single-ended analog inputs and preamp outputs. I'll show you this view of the top of the amp too. We definitely see some venting going on here, and then some of the circuit, like some of the capacitors and all of that, are a little bit visible through the venting there. And just generally, this amp runs warm, right? Like it doesn't get super hot, but it definitely needs some room to breathe. So you want to be very careful about stacking anything on top of this. Make sure there's plenty of air gap between anything that might be on top of this. You might also want to consider like propping it up above just the desk surface a little bit, because these rubber feet on the bottom are not very high. So there is air that can get under there to get to this bottom plate to help a little bit, but not a lot. So you might want to consider elevating it just slightly, also just to protect your desktop, because it does get a little bit warmer underneath. And then you also want to make sure you leave room on either end, because we have some ventilation holes on either end as well that also need room to breathe. So other than that, like it's also, you see that it's oddly shaped in that it's very wide but short and not particularly deep. It is 16 inches across, and I think they said like 8 inches deep and 2 inches high, right about there. Okay, which it is 2 bifrosts in width, about 1.25-ish bifrosts deep, and then a single bifrost high, if you are familiar with Schiit's Bifrost DAC in there in terms of its size. Okay, the build is, is solid. Like Schiit's build quality is usually pretty good. I went with the silver finish, which is an extra $100, by the way. The 1,300 US dollars is the base price for the black cover. I think the silver Schiit looks better than the black Schiit, so I ponied up the extra $100 for the silver just because I like the look of it. I think that's nice. So that's what I went with there. But again, it's black is the standard at $1,300. Okay. Shall we go ahead and get into test gear and sound and headphone pairings and all of that? Because I'm sure that's what you're here for. And yeah, I think we should go ahead and get into that. All right. Test gear. I basically used 2 DACs primarily for testing here. I have in for review the Musician Pegasus 2, which is very similar to the Denafrips Aries 12th Anniversary Edition. So that is a balanced R2R or ladder DAC. That goes for about 1,000 USD, maybe 1,100 USD, right around in there. So I used that on here some, but most of the time I spent with my Berkeley Alpha Series 2 DAC using the balanced inputs on these things. I did find that the balanced input on this was a little bit better, as was the balanced headphone output. I really would not recommend using the single-ended headphone output on this because it just did not have the detail or the clarity or the drive of the balanced output. So keep that in mind as well. All right, but those were the DACs I used, and they both would have been fed by my Singer SU6 DDC, which was in turn fed by Sonor Ultra Rendu Streamer, which is a Rune endpoint where I would play local FLAC or DSD files, the FLAC files being lossless or high-res, or stream lossless or high-res FLAC files via Qobuz, again, all through Rune. All right, headphones that I tried on this thing are numerous, and there is a reason for that, which I've alluded to already and we'll get to in a moment. But I'll kind of divide them up by headphone type here. Low impedance dynamic driver headphones, I used Focal Radiance and my Lawton TH900, which has the Foztex TH900 Mark II drivers in it. They're 1.5 Tesla biocellulose dynamic driver in there. High impedance dynamic headphones. I used the 300 ohm Mastrop Sennheiser HD6XX, the 300 ohm ZMF Atrium Closed, which is right here, and the Beyerdynamic DT880. That one is a 600 ohm headphone, and I have removable cable modded that one. I've removed the stock cable and did a dual cable entry on it so that I could use it with balanced cables and plugged it into the balanced outputs of headphone amps such as this one. All right, medium impedance dynamic driver, if you will. I tried the Focal Utopia, which is nominally an 80 ohm headphone, but it does spike up to 300 ohms near its driver's resonant frequency, which is somewhere around 80 hertz, I think. Okay, so in that range. Okay, low impedance, easy driving planars. Hi-Fi-Man HE1000 SE, Hi-Fi-Man HE1000 Stealth Magnet Edition. That's the HE1000 V3 basically, or V2 Stealth. Goes by several different names. And then also the Hi-Fi-Man Aria Organic. Got some time in there. And then at the beginning, when this had just come in and I had a brief window to do a very brief listen with the Dan Clark Audio E3 on this as well. Okay. Medium impedance planar headphones here. I dug out my Odyssey LCD2, which is about 80 ohms in there. And so that's an old pre-phaser version. I tried that on here. I also tried the Hi-Fi-Man HE6 SE V2, which I'm going to call medium impedance. It's about 50 ohms of impedance, and it's about 83 decibel per milliwatt sensitivity, which is why it is a more on the difficult side of things to drive. Okay. High impedance planars, high-ish impedance. Hi-Fi-Man Susvara, and then I have the double-sided Modhouse Tungsten right here in for review. I know a lot of you are impatiently waiting for that review. Ryan is working on getting me a single-sided version of this, and I'm going to try to review them together. Hopefully that other one gets here soon and I get a chance to listen to that. Okay. Did I try anything else? But I think you see, did I mention Susvara? Yeah, I'm pretty sure I mentioned Susvara. If I didn't mention Susvara, I used Susvara on here as well. Okay. So that is a lot, and there ended up being a key reason why I ended up, using so many different headphones, and that was because some really interesting stuff came out when I did the comparison with the Vio HPA V222. Okay, so let's talk about the sound that you get from the Mjolnir 3 on its own before we get to the comparisons and then do a deep dive on those headphone pairings, okay? The sound on the Mjolnir 3 follows in the footsteps of the balanced headphone output from Schiit's Jotunheim 2 amplifier. It is a little bit more neutral in terms of its tuning and its tonality, but it has a lot of dynamics. It's a very active sound. It's a very potent, hard-hitting kind of sound to it as well. And I think there is just a slight emphasis here in the Mjolnir 3 in the clarity range. The upper mids are just a skosh forward. Not a lot, but just a touch, such that the clarity steps up just a little bit more than, say, a true neutral kind of signature. The bass extension on it is good, but it's not super extendy. Like, it doesn't reach down with a whole lot of grunt as some amplifiers do, but I don't think you're going to find it lacking with most program material either. Same thing up at the top end. There's some pretty decent air and treble extension, but not like crazily so. There are other amps out there that do it a little bit better, but through the frequency range that it is comfortable reproducing, outside of those extremes, there's usually pretty good tonal balance between fundamentals and harmonics and that sort of thing in there. Save for that just slight bit of added clarity that comes through the upper mids, lower treble, where it's just bumped up just a little bit. Now, you hear me complain a lot about shoutiness and honkiness in my headphone sound, and I don't like that. I did notice that slight upper mid bump here, but it was very slight, and very rarely did it cause a problem for me. And only would it cause a problem if the headphone that I was using was already walking that line of being just a little bit too forward in that range. So then it would take some of those headphones and just push them a little bit further over that just a little bit too much for me thing. But more often than not, it was fine. And then there were some headphones, like Hi-Fi Mins in particular, where that slight mid-forwardness actually like synergized pretty well, I would say. And I'll unpack that a little bit more coming up as well. Okay, let's come back to the dynamics and the impactfulness of it, because the fact that this thing is named after a mythical hammer is kind of a descriptive of its sound, because it is very punchy. It is powerful sounding, even though it is rated at only 2 watts of output power into a 32 ohm load. It sounds very robust and powerful and in control with particularly low impedance headphones. It really grabs them and controls them well, and there is a lot of impact on those dynamics. The attacks of kick drums, okay, strong plucks of electric bass guitars and all of those things, they will slap you around pretty good coming from this amp. Snare drums have a really quick, snappy, and just dynamic like attack to them. And that sort of thing. Trailing ends of tones, the decays are well timed. It strikes a good balance, I think, between not sounding dry, but not really sounding wet either. So it's kind of right down the middle in terms of the decay length on the trailing ends of things and all of that. But just it comes across as a very active, dynamic, lively kind of presentation. And frankly, to the point where it can sound aggressive. So I say, like, it's appropriate that it's named after a hammer, because it does in some sense sound like it's taking a brute force approach to sound reproduction in a lot of ways. Like, you're just taking an audio hammer and banging away at things, which has a fun and engaging impact at times, but at other times, like, there could be music where you just don't want it to be quite that. It's just a little bit overdone with some more mellower kind of chill, kick back and relax kind of music. But for a lot of the genres that I like, such as heavy metal, rock of various subgenres, okay, some EDM, some hip hop, and like big scale, grand kind of classical and soundtrack kind of orchestral works, that activity and that dynamic, lively, brute force, if you will, kind of presentation matches that kind of music taste well, at least for my ears. Okay, the spatial presentation on this is also quite good. There's a big but not huge soundstage, nor is it small. It's like, it doesn't really stand out in either direction for me in terms of its size. It does have very good lateral holography in terms of the imaging and the separation. Imaging being like where in the sound field is something present, the separation being where, where is sound not coming from, creating space between sonic images. Another aspect of the spatial presentation that stands out when you jump up to an amp of this price, say from a mid-fi amp that's like in the $400 to $800 range, is the soundstage depth and layering. Like there's just a better sense of like how far away from you do sounds sound like they are coming from, with a fairly decent sense of layering in them as well, and this amp does a pretty good job with that. Resolution and detail retrieval is also pretty good. There's lots of good texturing in bass notes in particular, so not only is the bass punchy and powerful sounding with good pitch definition, it also is well controlled and textured. Room reverbs come through pretty clearly and all of that. I really have no issues with the resolution or the detail retrieval here, and the details are presented in a fairly natural way. They don't sound pulled back, they don't sound pushed forward, anything like that to my ear. So that is all pretty good. All right, let's real quick talk about what these buttons over here, these switches over here, make sure you can see them, these switches over here do. The single-ended Class A mode, I think, is the preferable mode here, as opposed to the push-pull. The magnitude of the difference that switching into push-pull makes varies with Headphone, and there are some situations where it helps, but when I could get away with not having it on, I didn't have it on. Okay, it does help a little bit with harder driving loads. I heard this difference most clearly with the HiFiMan HE6 SEV2, which we'll get to in a little bit here, in terms of is probably the most difficult driving headphone that this amp is really truly comfortable with. And when I went from the single-ended Class A mode to the push-pull, what I noticed with that HE6 SEV2 is just there was a little bit more overall control. Kick drums sounded a little less splashy. They sounded a little tighter and more in control on the attack with the push-pull mode. The spatial holography tightened up a little bit. The separation of it in particular, the space between sonic images just became a little bit more convincing and a little bit more real. The treble also smoothed out, became a little bit less sharp, a little bit less harsh on that particular headphone as well. The trade-off, the downside, if you will, is the already slight forwardness in that clarity range that I talked about that's just present in this amp is pushed forward just a little bit when you activate the push-pull mode. At least that's what my ears picked out. And this happens the most. Again, the HE6 SEV2 was where this impact of the push-pull mode came out the most. And but that difference was present on all of the headphones that I tried. Except for maybe that bass control, the splashiness kind of thing, or the tightening up of the separation. But that forwardness is what I'm talking about. That mid-range forwardness comes out more. The lower impedance stuff, the Radiants, the HiFimans, the HE1000s, the Aria Organic, like those kinds of things, they don't need any of that extra stuff. They sound tight and in control and punchy and all of that. With just the single-ended Class A mode, I would let them be there. But the Atrium Closed and the HE6 SEV2, the DT880, like things like that, that's where like the push-pull mode starts to make a bigger difference and tightens up the sound. But again, the trade-off is that slightly more mid-forward. So again, my preference is, if I can get away with it, just because I preferred the tonality of the single-ended Class A mode, but I did appreciate how the other technicalities improved a little bit on some harder to drive loads with the single-ended, or excuse me, with the push-pull mode activated. The feedback on this, I checked it, and I really didn't use it much after that, because the feedback on this starts to make it sound like a topping amp, basically, and I'm not a fan of that. Okay, it just started to take like that mid-forwardness that I talked about came through even more with the feedback mode than just switching from the single-ended to the push-pull. And so, again, I already don't really like that trait, and it's just kind of walking the line of where I can handle it in just the pure single-ended mode here. without the feedback. So the feedback, having it on there, it just like it just gave it a little bit more. It gave it more glare, and it just gave it like a more etched, almost digital kind of quality to the sound that I didn't particularly appreciate. But some others out there may like it. But that was just what my ears told me on those modes. And so as I mentioned, some of the things that I learned about this amplifier came as I compared it to the Vioelectric HPA V222. And that was really where I started to discover like what was happening and like the difference in performance of the Mjolnir 3 with low impedance loads versus high impedance loads. And so let's get into this comparison, because I know a lot of you are clamoring to hear this, and then we'll use that as a springboard to get into talking about individual headphone pairings, because this is how I kind of learned what was going on here. The V222, if you remember my review of it, and the DHA V226, because it's the same amp circuit in either amp there. Warmer, thicker, smoother sound with a bigger soundstage than what the Mjolnir throws generally. And like it takes after kind of the of Schiit's Asgard 3 sound, or the single-ended output of the Jotunheim 2, where it's kind of stereotypically tube-like, and again, warmer and thicker. And then also like the Niche Pietus Maximus, which again is also in large part a Schiit design, like has that kind of a sound too, where the Mjolnir 3 takes after Lake People's, like the owner and makers of Vioelectric, takes after Lake People's G111 Mark II in terms of its presentation from a signature standpoint, and the balanced output of their Jotunheim 2. That kind of a sound. So it's just a little bit funny to me how like the two brands crossed there. Like I don't know if someone from Schiit went to Lake People or someone from Lake People went to Schiit, and I know I've made this joke before, but it's funny, so I'm going to make it again. And so I don't know if the two companies, Schiit and Lake People, have quietly combined to call themselves Schiit People or Lake Schiit. I don't know. I'm just saying that like their sound signatures are kind of similar and overlapping and crisscrossing in a lot of those ways. All right. That said, what I noticed is that I preferred the Mjolnir 3 over the V222 with low impedance loads, and I preferred the V222 over the Mjolnir 3 for high impedance loads. And generally speaking, it seems to be right at about 60 ohms, somewhere in there. Call it between 50 and 60 ohms, but in that range where the switch happens. HE1000 SE, HE1000 Stealth Magnet Edition, Aria Organic, Focal Radiance, the Lawton TH900, what else? I mean, that's enough, because that's 5 data points right there. I preferred on the Mjolnir 3 over the V222. And the differences were, the Mjolnir 3 sounded quieter, it sounded cleaner, it sounded quieter, lower sonic background. Okay, in those ranges. It sounded a little bit more resolving. It sounded clearer. It was more dynamic and impactful, which I enjoy, than the V22 was there through that range. Higher impedance loads. The Atrium Closed, the DT880, the HD6XX, even my old Audeze LCD2, which again is about an 80 ohm load. All of those I preferred on the V222. Everything that I just described about the Mjolnir 3 being cleaner, quieter, a little bit more resolving, okay, a little bit more holographic and that sort of thing with low impedance loads, flips. This amp, the V222, sounds cleaner, quieter, clearer, slightly more resolving, slightly more holographic, and a little bit more dynamic and active and lively with those higher impedance loads than does the Mjolnir 3. Okay, so that's really where I started to learn this, and I was like kind of surprised in a way. It doesn't surprise me that it's the Vio that's the better sounding amp for high impedance loads when I think about it, because Vio's V200 series was designed, over a decade ago to do really well with high impedance loads, when things like the HD 800 and the HD 600, 650 were kind of like the top dog headphones at the time. Okay, and even the LCD2 was out there, back then as well, which again about 80 ohms, so that did really well for that kind of a load. But we're in a a space now in the headphone market where the lower impedance stuff is becoming much, much more common. And so the Mjolnir 3 is more comfortable there, even though Vio claims that they have redesigned their V200 series to be more comfortable with the lower impedance loads. That could be than the old V200. Okay, this could be better than the old V200 in that regard, but it hasn't quite caught what the Mjolnir 3 is doing with those kinds of headphones. All right, what about the stuff in the middle like Utopia? Utopia doesn't like either of these amps. Utopia is just very picky, doesn't sound particularly good on either the Mjolnir 3 or the V222, so never mind that one, okay? Let's talk about the extremely hard to drive cases of the Modhouse Tungsten, the Hi-Fi-Man Susvara, and then a little bit the Hi-Fi-Man HE6SEV2. I think the Mjolnir 3 is out for the Tungsten and the Susvara. Not only are they higher impedance generally than it feels comfortable with, like the Susvara might be right on the line for Mjolnir 3 in terms of impedance load it is comfortable with, but then when you combine the 60 ohm impedance of the Susvara with its, like 80, 83 decibel sensitivity, something like that, it is a very difficult load, and the Mjolnir 3 just doesn't quite have the power for that. It makes the Susvara sound a little bit soft, a little bit too blended together. Like it loses, the Susvara does not quite have the clarity or the resolution that it normally has, and it definitely doesn't have the bass impact. So what is normally a very dynamic, powerful sounding amplifier doesn't really sound that with the Susvara to my ear. Also, that mid-range forwardness that I talked about on here on the Mjolnir 3 comes forward even more with the Susvara. Okay, and so I just generally didn't like that pairing. The Susvara doesn't do great on the V222 either, so like I wouldn't say that those two really belong together much at all as well. The Tungsten is an interesting case. The Tungsten at least sounds good enough on some tracks on the Mjolnir 3 that it's going to trick some people into thinking the Mjolnir 3 is a good amp for the Tungsten. You start getting into some more demanding stuff like the 1812 Overture or some heavy metal works, things like that, where there's just a lot going on in the music. Then you can hear where the Mjolnir 3 really starts to struggle with the Tungsten. It just becomes very harsh, very fatiguing. That mid-range forwardness becomes even more noticeable, like just being pushed even more aggressively forward. And then it also comes with a lot of sibilance and brittle timbre in the treble to my ears through the Modhouse Tungsten. So again, I don't think that the Mjolnir 3 has quite the power output, particularly in terms of voltage, that it needs to drive that load. However, if you're into just more chill, laid-back music that doesn't demand a whole lot of the amp, then you might get away with the Tungsten. Like, it's good enough on those more chill genres of music or chill tracks that it's going to convince some that it's a good pairing. But across the board, can I universally say it's a good pairing? No, I can't. That is a contrast to the Vio here because my experience so far suggests that, and I haven't listened to the pairing a lot, but just enough to check it in comparing these two, is that the Tungsten actually sounds pretty decent through the Vio V22. Again, Vio's ability to drive high impedance loads might be an advantage there because the Tungsten, I believe, is 150 ohms of impedance, just very low sensitivity. And Vios have always been good at high voltage output. So particularly with the input gain adjusted up on the Vio V22, I think that one has a shot at driving the Modhouse Tungsten. And it certainly sounded better driving the Tungsten to my ears than the Mjolnir 3 did. So that's another combination, another comparison here between the two amps to keep in mind, and also more about headphone pairings there. So circling back, actually, HE6SEV2. Sounds pretty good on the Mjolnir 3. And I mentioned earlier, and I think that's still true, I think the HE6SEV2 is the hardest driving headphone I have, and that I've been able to hear, that sounds good on the Mjolnir 3. And I think that's kind of the upper limit as to what this can drive. That headphone in the push-pull mode, okay, and in high gain, sounded tight, controlled, punchy, holographic, detailed, like all of those kinds of things. It sounded like what I think it's supposed to sound like. So that's a victory here, and I think it might actually sound a little bit better on the Mjolnir 3, the HE6 SEV2 that is, than it does on the V226. What's the difference? The HE6 SEV2 is a 50 ohm headphone. So I think that comes back to where I think the cutoff, like where it shifts, where the Mjolnir 3 is better than the Vio is for headphones less than 60 ohms of impedance, where the Vio is better than the Mjolnir is for headphones 60 ohms of impedance or higher, but then, you know, within reasonable sensitivity range, which means like it's not best for the Susvara, but it does seem to do okay with the Tungsten just because the Tungsten is higher yet in impedance. I think that's what the advantage that the Vio V22 has going for it there. All right, but it's worth repeating, the Mjolnir 3, and this is also true of the Vio V222, by the way, is neither amp ever sounds bad. High impedance loads still sound good on the Mjolnir 3, just not quite as good as they do on the Vio. Lower impedance loads still sound good on the Vio V222, just not as good as they do on the Mjolnir 3. Okay, but again, the Mjolnir 3 never sounds bad. Always sounds pretty good. It just goes from sounding good to excellent, with the excellent range being in those easier to drive, lower impedance loads. Last question to answer here. Does the Mjolnir 3 punch up? Does it compete with $2,500, $3,000 amps? Basically, amps double its price, right? And my experience is no. The Prelude, let's start with the HiFiMan Golden Wave Prelude there, regardless of headphone type, both high Z, low Z. So what I did here is, like, after I tried a bunch of different headphones to compare the V222 and the Mjolnir 3, I said, all right, I'm going to take the HiFiMan HE1000 SE, let it be the low impedance, easy driving representative headphone, and I'm going to take the Atrium Closed, let it be the high impedance representative headphone, and then I'm going to compare the Mjolnir 3 with the Prelude and the Vioelectric HPA V281. Okay, so on both those headphones, the HE1000 SE and the Atrium Closed, the Prelude just sounded noticeably superior to the Mjolnir 3, and honestly, it was a butt kicking. Okay, the Mjolnir 3 is cleaner, quieter, more in control, more holographic, more resolving. The only thing that it doesn't really do better is the dynamics on there. Like, that was just, and that's more of a signature presentation thing. It's, the Prelude is not undynamic, it's not laid back or it's like suppressed or squelched in the dynamics by any measure. It just doesn't emphasize the dynamics and the impact in the way that the Mjolnir 3 does. But every other sonic characteristic there, it was easily noticeable that the Prelude was the higher performing amp. The Prelude has a slight signature difference. It's just a little bit warmer and smoother in its presentation than the Mjolnir 3 is. But I mean, that's just a presentational thing, not necessarily a technical difference. But like, does the Mjolnir 3 compete with the $2,500 Prelude? To my ears, no. All right. What about the HPA V281, also from Vioelectric? This one got a little bit surprising. The Vio, the V281, is again the better amp, and noticeably so. I expected the gap between the Mjolnir 3 and the Vio V281 on the Atrium Closed to be enormous, though, because again, Vio 200 series, great with high impedance loads, and the Mjolnir 3 is not in its comfort zone with high impedance loads. And there was a gap. The V281 handled the Atrium Closed noticeably better than the Mjolnir 3. Sounding, again, like more in control, more resolving, more holographic, bigger in stage, and the Vio sound, like with that headphone, also brought the dynamics. It equaled the Mjolnir 3 in terms of the dynamics and the impact and that sort of thing with the Atrium Closed. The V281 is a little bit older model now, and so its noise floor is not quite as low as the Mjolnir 3 is, and that came out on the Atrium Closed fairly clearly. It's not that the V281 is noisy in an absolute sense, it's just that the noise floor is a little bit more noticeable than the Mjolnir 3. But again, outside of that one thing, The Vio was the more natural and more convincing, more real, like higher performing, more technically capable amplifier with the atrium closed. However, the gap there got even bigger, and this was the really surprising thing to me going to the V281. The gap between the two amps, the V281 and the Mjolnir 3, got even bigger with the HE1000 SE headphone. Again, low impedance, easy to drive, planar magnetic headphone. The Vio, for whatever reason, it sounded cleaner, quieter, like that noise floor dropped with that kind of a load, which really surprised me and got in line with what the Mjolnir 3 was doing. Okay, again, in terms of that noise floor. But the dynamics were there. The resolution was, again, just staggeringly good in comparison to the Mjolnir 3. The holography of the spatial presentation in all three dimensions, noticeably superior to the Mjolnir 3. Much more three-dimensional and holographic, and like all of that going on with there, and a lot more natural timbre. Like that jumped out to me too from the V281 as compared to the Mjolnir 3 with that headphone. So that gap was even bigger than it was with the atrium closed, and that really shocked me, just given Vio's approach to amplifiers and what the Mjolnir 3 is good at. So I don't know if there's just a special kind of synergy between the HE1000 SE and the HPA V281 or what, but like that, the difference was really noticeable and a lot bigger than I expected, and it really surprised me that that difference was bigger for the Hi-Fi Min than it was for the ZMF atrium closed. Okay. Where does all of that leave us with the Mjolnir 3 then? And I'll hold it up. It really is a very good headphone amplifier that, again, it always sounds at least good, and there are some cases where it sounds excellent. At its price of around $1,300 USD, it is arguably one of the best headphone amps out there right now for headphones that are below 60 ohms in impedance, and then it's just a merely good headphone amp for headphones that are above 60 ohms of impedance there at the price point. So whether it is worthwhile to you is going to depend on what kind of load you're going to put on it. But great resolution, holography, a really dynamic, lively, impactful kind of sound. The sound signature is mostly neutral with just a hint of upper mid forwardness that helps enhance the clarity a little bit, but then yeah, those dynamics, powerful, potent, hard hitting. You do have the option of feedback and push-pull mode versus single-ended Class A, and again, I would use the balanced headphone output on this thing, as the single-ended headphone output is really nothing to get all that excited about. But I do like this amp. I just can't quite get behind the level of hyperbole that is out there about it, because it doesn't catch, you know, the $2,500 Hi-Fi Min Golden Wave Prelude or the $2,800 Vioelectric HPA V281 amp. So it doesn't punch up in the way that some people claim, but that's okay. Okay. Products that do that in audio are extremely rare, and this is just a really rock solid, very good amp, even an excellent choice for low impedance loads at its price point. All right, so I am Wave Theory. This has been my review of the Schiit Mjolnir 3 headphone amplifier. Please remember to like if you haven't yet, subscribe if you haven't yet, leave a comment down below, check out my PayPal and check out my Patreon. Thanks again for watching, and as always, enjoy the music.